My next patron question is from Trevon, who wanted me to compare two movie studios. In their heyday, which former mini-major studio do you think was better? TriStar or New Line Cinema? These are both studios who have built impressive catalogs, although the output has changed somewhat since their initial founding. There's still the occasional film released by TriStar, but it mostly plays second fiddle to Sony's top movie label, Columbia. New Line, meanwhile, was completely absorbed by Warner Brothers in 2008, although if there's a hit horror movie released by WB, it was very likely produced by New Line. The golden period for New Line lasted from the 80s to the late 2000s. TriStar's lasted from their first films in 1984 up to the late 90s. Both have released films I have a lot of fondness for. With New Line, their crown jewel is absolutely Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. They took it on when few studios were particularly enthusiastic about it, but New Line managed to claw it away from Miramax and Harvey Weinstein, including telling Jackson it should be 3 films rather than the 1 or 2 movies Weinstein was trying to force him to condense Tolkien's books to. New Line also helped Paul Thomas Anderson's early career, and released my 2 favorite Anderson films, Magnolia and Boogie Nights. Another New Line film from around that time I have a lot of affection for is Pleasantville, while Seven remains one of the high points of David Fincher's impressive filmography. New Line was also instrumental in getting John Waters' career off the ground, leading to a string of deranged yet inspired comedies. They even released the musical film adaptation of Hairspray. A Nightmare on Elm Street remains an important horror film in the 80s, and they were also the original distributor of Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead. New Line has a history of releasing comedies that stood out thanks to how they used their lead actors and executed their premises. These include Drop Dead Fred, Friday, The Mask, Elf, Wedding Crashers, Be Kind Rewind, and Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. When it comes to TriStar Pictures, I personally most associate the studio with their fantasy films. For example, I cannot be reminded of their Pegasus logo without thinking of Steven Spielberg's wonderful movie, Hook. There was also Danny DeVito's adaptation of Matilda and Jim Henson's musical adventure Labyrinth, which are also important parts of the TriStar library in my book. Then you have some of the Oscar winners released by TriStar in the 90s. I think Jerry Maguire, Philadelphia, The Fisher King, and As Good as It Gets are all great films that fit well within their directors' filmographies and make particularly good use of the actors in them. I, of course, have to mention The Natural, one of my favorite baseball movies and the first movie produced by TriStar. Another early TriStar release is The Muppets Take Manhattan, and I recently saw the remake of The Blob, directed by Chuck Russell and co-written by Frank Darabont. I found it to be one of the more inspired and creative horror remakes, especially of the 80s, and it's one I think deserves more attention. In the romantic comedy genre, Sleepless in Seattle is one of my favorites, and It Could Happen to You is an incredibly sweet film with a positive message. TriStar had a distribution deal with Kuroko Pictures, and that resulted in them releasing some worthwhile titles. Probably the most notable was Terminator 2 Judgment Day, one of the most renowned action films of the 90s for good reason. Another Kuroko film distributed by TriStar was Total Recall, directed by Paul Verhoeven. And then there's a movie I have a major soft spot towards, Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin is my favorite director, so a biopic of his life would obviously appeal to me. Despite some expected historical liberties taken here and there, I thought Richard Attenborough did a really good job, and Robert Downey Jr. was excellent as Chaplin. Regarding which studio I think had the better heyday, both TriStar and New Line have plenty of things to offer. After New Line's initial success as a horror movie and independent film distributor, they really showed a keen eye for promising talent and taking certain risks. And even after it started making more prestige films, the studio never forgot where it started and continued to greenlight offbeat horror films with promising concepts. Meanwhile, TriStar worked well within the studio system in delivering crowd-pleasing fare in addition to several solid dramatic films. However, it does seem like the fantasy movies are what TriStar will be most remembered for, and it was nice to see the Pegasus appear in front of Matilda the musical recently. However, if I have to pick one studio I prefer, I'm going to go with TriStar. I've certainly loved a good amount of what New Line has released, especially Magnolia and The Lord of the Rings, but TriStar seem to have a particular knack for heartwarming movies, and those do often win out for me. Now let me know in the comments whether you prefer New Line Cinema or TriStar Pictures, and thank you for your question, Trevon.